Distinguished and respected colleagues, I remain Senator T.A. Orji. I represent Abia Central, and I want to read this bill for the second time. Your Excellency, my colleagues, recall that this bill was read for the first time on the floor of the Senate on Wednesday, 2nd October 2019. The bill seeks to make provision for freedom from hunger, create basic right to food of acceptable quality, and the right of every child to basic nutrition. The right to food is a basic human right which protects the right of all human beings to be free from hunger, food insecurity, and malnutrition. Food and its production are the most basic of human concerns and were at the foundation of civilization. Despite the tremendous progress achieved by humanity, we continue to struggle to meet the basic need of mankind. It is important to point out that food security means far more than having sufficient food to meet human needs on a national basis. Other very important factors include access to safe drinking water, primary health care, and environmental hygiene. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, after the world food crisis in 2008, developing countries have been enacting laws aimed at food security. Mauritius, for example, enacted a food security fund to enhance local production of food by tackling all the problems militating against it. The importance of this bill to our growing economy can easily be seen in the objectives and purposes of the bill contained in Section 3 of the bill. They include: A, to provide a framework that promotes the realization of the right to freedom from hunger and access to food of acceptable quality as a fundamental human right. B, to provide a framework that promotes the elimination and prevention of discrimination of marginalized groups in the access and distribution of food. C, to provide a framework that promotes food production, self-sustenance, and food security in relation to all persons in Nigeria. D, to provide a framework and mechanism for the coordinated implementation of the national policy, programs, and plans on food security by state governments. E, to provide a mechanism for ensuring that poor persons access food at all times in inadequate quantities and quality through the implementation of state-sponsored programs. Mr. President, my distinguished colleagues, whereas Section 4 of the bill has heaped obligations, guides, and principles on all persons that get involved with food security, under Sections 5 and 6, both federal and state governments are obliged to carry out certain functions that relate to availability, acceptability, adaptability, and accessibility of food to all in Nigeria. In the same vein, by the provisions of Section 8 of the bill, federal and state governments shall, to the extent of their mandate under the Constitution, guarantee and promote child nutrition. And by Section 9, every woman has the right to adequate food during pregnancy and lactation. Mr. President, my distinguished colleague, Part 3 of the bill establishes the Food Security Agency. Some of the functions of the agency in the bill include: A, to formulate strategies, plans, and programs to facilitate the realization of the rights to food, taking into consideration the right of vulnerable and marginalized persons. B, to monitor and evaluate the implementation of policies, plans, and strategies on food security and nutrition in Nigeria by the Food Security Committees. C. Appraise and review the levels of access to food by all Nigerians in terms of quantity and quality, and liaise with the Food Security Committee and relevant agencies to ensure optimal access. D. To collaborate with relevant agencies and stakeholders in the establishment of appropriate mechanisms to ensure access to food by poor persons to adequate food in both quantity and quality. E. To promote measures to improve security and access to land and water resources and the optimum and sustainable utilization of these resources. Section 10 of the bill prohibits discrimination by government against any person or persons and makes provision for remedy of past discrimination in relation to right to food. The management of the agency is vested in a board established under Section 14 of the bill. There are, of course, provisions for chairmanship, membership of the board, tenure of office, powers of the board, etc., etc. By the provisions of Section 32 of the bill, there shall be established in each state of the Federation a State Food Security Committee whose functions shall include A. To implement the food security policy and programs in the state, advise the agency on technical issues relating to implementation of different programs on food security within the state. That's B. C. Provide early warnings and mechanisms on implementing food security situations within the states and advise on mitigation measures. D. To initiate, undertake, and participate in the collection, preparation, production, and dissemination of data and information on food security and nutrition in the state. E. To ensure proper identification of food in insecure areas, appropriate programs, and eligible beneficiaries in relation to food security. Section 35, Part 7 of the bill establishes a food insecurity and information mapping system, making it mandatory for the agency to work in collaboration with ministries of finance, disaster management, planning, and national security to provide the information needed to develop and strengthen the capacity to respond to food emergencies. Provision is also made in the bill on food impact assessment. Under Section 37, the President has the power to declare a food emergency if, in his opinion, there's a major shortfall in the domestic production or availability of a designated agricultural commodity. When the President declares a food emergency, the powers of the agency abate and vest in the minister. Ample provisions have also been made in the bill in relation to funds of the agency, investment of funds, annual estimates, accounts, and audit of accounts of the agency. Part 10, sections 44 to 49 are miscellaneous provisions which enact offenses and penalties in relation to food security. Mr. President, my distinguished colleagues, with a phenomenal population growth in Nigeria, agricultural production can no longer be self-regulated, with new food and waterborne diseases springing up every day, with the phenomenon of climate change having drastic effects on food production. Government at all levels must rise up and ensure that the whole population have access. They have access. Sorry, my dear. They have access to full requirement of adequate food of acceptable quality and quantity. Governments must be committed to creating and sustaining the enabling political, social, and economic environment, which are essential foundation to give priority to food security and poverty eradication. These are what the bill is all about. In line with our Order 77.3, A compendium of the financial implication of the bill is attached. I therefore wish to appeal to Mr. President and my distinguished and respected colleagues to support that this bill be read for a second time. Thank you.
I rise to support the second reading of this bill, which seeks to make an act for the provision of freedom from hunger and the right to adequate food. Mr. President, I recall that during my tenure in the House of Reps in the 8th Assembly, I moved a similar bill, though that was for the amendment of the Constitution on right to food. I want to commend the sponsor of this bill for raising an issue that addresses the well-being of citizens. Food security is so critical that one of the first protests that was recorded in Bible history had to do with the issue of food. When Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt, they came to a point where a massive protest arose as a result of hunger. Food, therefore, is so critical that it's one of the basic needs, if not the primary need, of humanity. In addressing this bill, Mr. President, I want to highlight just two issues, and that is about availability and accessibility. We talk about food security. The first and major thing is to make food available. And availability is a function of production, of food production, which is also contingent on how well our farmers are empowered to grow and produce farm crops and products. And that will require the introduction and application of applicable and appropriate technology to modernize and upgrade our farming practices, which is largely peasant agriculture, to mechanized farming. There is also the need that if we must have food security and to strengthen production, that we must empower our farmers with credit facilities at concessional rates that will bring bank interest to one-digit margin. In also addressing the issue of production, Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, one issue that has constituted a threat to production of food in the country is the insecurity that we have witnessed for quite some time now, from insurgency to banditry, which has led to displacement of most farming communities, and that is a major threat to food production, which now constitutes a threat to food security in our country. The second point is that of accessibility. And next to food availability is accessibility. If food is available, the next thing is how empowered are our citizens for them to buy the food that is available. So if you tackle the issue of availability, the next is accessibility. And one of the greatest threats to accessibility is poverty. And given the level of poverty in this country, many citizens and households do not have the wherewithal to secure and have access to sustainable food and feeding. So if we must address this, we need to tackle the issue of poverty. Otherwise, food security and accessibility will largely remain a mirage. On this note, Mr. President, I want to support the reading of this bill and to commend the sponsor and to say that the twin issues of availability and accessibility are very, very necessary for us to tackle if we must guarantee food security. Thank you, Mr. President and distinguished colleagues.
Senator Bala Ibn Allah.
So while in principle, the bill is fundamentally in consonance with the yearnings and aspirations of Nigeria, when it comes to committee level, it's important that we understand the fact that those rights and freedoms that have been guaranteed internationally have been domesticated by the various countries in their constitution. And Mr. President, you will have had the opportunity to read the contents of our constitution, and you will have seen that that right is not particularly mentioned in the constitution. And then we are trying to make a law. Under our jurisprudence, we cannot make a law to override the constitution because the constitution is the grand norm. So maybe what we do is that in its contents, we remove the freedom, and then we put right. And then we see how we can project certain provisions of the bill to make those rights available to youths in this country, the children in particular, so that we do not run foul of our constitution, and then somebody can just go and say that we do not possess the power to make that law. Mr. President, if you look at Section 45 of the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria as altered, with your permission I read, it says, nothing in Section 37, 38, 39, 40, and 41 of this Constitution shall invalidate any law that is reasonably justifiable in a democratic society. And then it went on to say, A, in the interest of defense, public safety, public order, public morality, or public health. Now, where this bill it can properly be anchored is B, for the purpose of protecting the rights and freedom of other people. So those rights can be established by law, but we cannot establish freedom by law that is not contained in the fundamental human rights provision of Chapter 4 of our Constitution. So I think this is where we should be a little bit careful. But the principle and contents of the bill I strongly support, and I urge the committee, when it comes to the committee for consideration, to look at this slippery area that has to do with the constitutionalism of the existence of that provision, to see how we can bring it into conformity with our own constitution. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
A bill for an act to make provisions for freedom from hunger and the right to adequate food of acceptable quality, the right of every child to basic nutrition, and for connected purposes 2019, second reading taken, and the bill is referred to the Committee on Agriculture and Rural Development to report back within 4 weeks. Thank you very much, distinguished colleagues. Leader Wisani.